The hotline for missing children received a call about a strange teenager on the streets of the town of Orthez in the south of France. Representatives from social services found the frightened teenager. They had no idea that he was one of the most brilliant impostors in history. The teenager barely spoke. He had only a mobile phone and documents under the name Fernando Fernandez. The teenager claimed to be Spanish, saying that his parents and brother had died in a car accident. He had survived a coma and fled from an abusive uncle to France. The teenager was placed in a shelter. Thin, short, with a baseball cap pulled over his eyes and wide pants. Despite signs of psychological trauma, the teenager showed academic success and made friends. However, after a month, surprising details emerged. It turned out that Fernando was not Fernando at all. He had a different name, surname, and date of birth. This teenager was actually a 30-year-old man, a person who had impersonated others for many years. The number of fake identities exceeded several hundred. And this is not the only protagonist in this narrative. I will recount 3 stories. Their characters are some of the most skillful imposters who for decades pretended to be other people. How did they do it? For what purpose? And perhaps the main question, why did the victims willingly believe them? In the 1950s, a professor at an American university studying crime called con artists the aristocrats of the criminal world. Robbers, burglars, murderers, and others relied on threats, brute force, and cruelty. The main tools of con artists are entirely different: trust, sympathy, persuasion. In a way, they do not steal, things are given to them. Thus, if we consider con artists the aristocrats of crime, imposter con artists are the main representatives of this elite. They manage to conduct complex operations as surgeons, knowing nothing about medicine, led universities with only a school education, and convinced strangers that they were heirs of the world's wealthiest families or 15-year-olds. And now many might recall DiCaprio. In the legendary film Catch Me If You Can, he portrayed the famous identity-changing con artist Frank Abagnale. Abagnale is a real person. He wrote a book about his exploits, and Spielberg made a movie based on it. A great story, a wonderful film. However, much of what Frank Abagnale wrote about himself was either grossly exaggerated or did not happen at all. But even that is not the most intriguing part. If one were to accept Abagnale's entire story as gospel truth, he would likely not make even the top 5 most talented imposters in history. Today we'll talk about potential leaders of that list, about people who orchestrated numerous schemes over decades, changed hundreds of identities, and managed to remain free. The story of several hundred fake identities and one real disappearance, 2005, City Power, France. Here is a shelter where social services place Fernando Fernandez, found on the street. Besides him, there are several hundred children and adolescents in the institution, most from disadvantaged families. Initially, Fernando behaves secretively, never changing clothes in front of others, refusing medical examination, and always wearing a baseball cap and scarf, covering a significant part of his face. He cites a large number of scars from a car accident as the reason. The administration of the shelter, despite strict rules, makes an exception for Fernando, considering his traumatic experience. Gradually, the teenager makes friends and shows significant academic achievements, quickly memorizing new information. Teachers also note Fernando's charisma and artistic abilities. At one event, he skillfully impersonates Michael Jackson. A little over a month passes, and the shelter administrator sees a television program about one of the most famous con artists in history. His name is Frédéric Bourdin, a 30-year-old Frenchman who has posed as teenagers numerous times. And this impostor is strikingly similar to the recently arrived Fernando Fernandez. The same chin, the same gap between the front teeth. The shelter employee calls the police. The teenager is taken for questioning, where his cap and scarf are removed. There are no scars on the teenager's head. Instead, there are signs of balding and a tattoo on his right arm. Just 2 words: chameleon from Nantes. Soon he admits that his real name is Frédéric Bourdin. He is 30 years old, 15 of which he spent impersonating other people. The scope of the impostor's activities is astonishing. He was Benjamin Kent, Alexander Doyle, Orno Orion, Jimmy Morris, Michelangelo Martini, and 100 more fictional personalities. The fraudster operated in 15 countries and in 5 languages. The media attributed different personas to him, from a tiger tamer to a priest, but it was almost always the same character, a teenager in distress. Bourdin meticulously crafted his character. He watched his weight to remain thin, wore baggy clothes, constantly shaved any facial hair, and worked on his walk, manners, behavior, and accent. The impostor was so immersed in his role that he even managed to deceive doctors. A year earlier, a doctor examining him, supposedly a teenager, in a shelter in another French city, firmly concluded he was 14 years old. Bourdin was 29 at the time. For 15 years, the impostor roamed shelters, children's hospitals, and foster families across Europe and the United States. In 2005, police in a city in France began an investigation. The main goal is to determine the motivation of the impostor Bourdin, a 30-year-old man pretending to be a teenager to get into shelters. The assumptions suggest themselves. However, during the investigation, it turns out that there were no unlawful actions on Bourdin's part towards the teenagers, and he did not gain any financial benefit from it. Strange? Moreover, this is not the only mystery in the biography of the conman impostor. Perhaps the greatest secret in the history of Frédéric Bourdin concerns his stay in the United States. This story began in a shelter in a small Spanish town. In 1997, Bourdin was 23, and he was once again trying to pass himself off as a teenager. However, the authorities were not fooled and gave him 24 hours to confirm his identity. Otherwise, they would take his fingerprints and start an investigation. In the meantime, Bourdin was forbidden to leave the shelter's premises. Frédéric was already known to European law enforcement for his frauds, but he had not yet served any real prison time. Now, he was an adult of legal age and understood that prison was a very real possibility if the local authorities did take his fingerprints and reported him to Interpol. The option of escaping was not considered, as Bourdin was closely monitored by the shelter's administration. Frédéric decided that the best solution would be to find an actually existing, not invented teenager whom he could impersonate. He asked the shelter's administration to use the phone and began calling operators of centers for missing children in the United States. By that time, Bourdin already had a good command of English thanks to constant travel. He introduced himself as the director of the Spanish shelter and said that they had a teenager claiming to be American. For the description, the con man provided his own characteristics: short, skinny, with a gap between the front teeth. Eventually, one of the operators in the United States said it could be Nicholas Barclay. 13-year-old Barclay had disappeared 3 years earlier in the city of San Antonio in the southern part of the country. When last seen, he was wearing purple pants, a white t-shirt, and carrying a pink backpack. Bourdin asked the operator to fax him a photo of the missing boy. After receiving the image, he claimed that Nicholas Barclay was in front of him. The operator gave the conman the phone number of the San Antonio police. Bourdin called them, posing as an officer of the Spanish police, and reported details that the missing children's service operator had managed to tell him about the backpack, t-shirt, and purple pants. As a result, information about the miraculously found American teenager reached the FBI and the American embassy in Madrid. But there was one problem. Frédéric Bourdin barely resembled the missing teenager, and it was not about the age at all. The original Nicholas Barclay had blonde hair, blue eyes, and several tattoos. Bourdin, of course, is a good actor, but changing one's skin color, eye color, and facial features so radically is practically impossible. And the most crucial aspect is that he was a missing American teenager. So it was necessary to convince not only the official authorities of several countries, but also the boy's relatives, including his mother. The impostor began to realize that this time prison was inevitable. A good liar uses the truth. This was one of the main secrets of his mastery as an impostor, as described by Frédéric Bourdin. When he invented a new identity, he would detail the character as much as possible, including thinking through their biography. However, when your alter egos number in the dozens or even hundreds, it's easy to get confused. Therefore, it is important not to lie about everything and not to invent completely incredible things. Certain biographical details, names, habits, and so on, are better taken from your own life or connected associatively to your life, otherwise you can easily get lost in your own lies during the process. All this seemed logical, however, in 1997. In the case of the American teenager, it didn't help Bourdain at all. How to become a real person who is not only 10 years younger but also mainly doesn't resemble you at all. In the end, the impostor comes up with a legend explaining everything. Supposedly, Nicholas Barclay was kidnapped by a gang involved in human trafficking. He was transferred to Europe, where he was tormented, including injections of various substances into his eyes, which changed their color. The French accent appeared because the kidnappers forbade the teenager from speaking English for 3 years. Frankly, a story about aliens abducting a teenager in America and transporting him on their spaceship to Europe might have seemed more believable than the legend invented by Bourdain. But the main thing is that even a stranger in their right mind couldn't confuse these people, let alone the relatives of the missing teenager. Frédéric Bourdain understood this. He was sure that his deception would be uncovered when Nicholas Barclay's biological sister, who had flown in from the United States, saw him at the American embassy. Out of habit, the fraudster pulled his cap down over his eyes, wrapped a scarf, and entered the room where the long-awaited meeting was to take place. However, upon seeing the teenager, Nicholas's sister did not become stupefied nor cause a scandal. Carey ran up and hugged him. She said nothing about his appearance or about his accent. She was genuinely happy to meet him. Later she showed photographs of the relatives. There was Nicholas Barclay's mother, Beverly, and older brother, Jason. The impostor examined the photos closely and listened to what the supposed sister said. For him, already an experienced fraudster, this was important information that would help him become a new identity and convince others of it. As a result, neither the Spanish authorities nor the United States authorities asked any questions. After the biological sister identified the missing brother, he was given an American passport, and the next day they departed for home to the United States. In the airport of the city of San Antonio, several relatives gathered, including Nicholas Barclay's mother, Beverly. They all joyously welcomed the miraculously found teenager. Frédéric Bourdain was a good actor and an experienced con artist. However, even he himself did not believe so much in his talent. How, why, what is the reason that people do not notice the obvious, that this is not their missing son and brother? Yes, the first meeting can be attributed to nervous tension and emotions, but after arriving in the United States, nothing changed. He was still continued to be considered Nicholas Barclay. The missing teenager's family was not unique for provincial America. The divorced mother worked nights in a fast food restaurant and occasionally indulged in substances. The same problem was with her older son, Jason. Upon arriving in the States, Frédéric Bourdain went to live with his new sister, Carey, and her husband. The new home was quite different from the con man's cinematic idea of a new country. It was a trailer in the middle of nowhere, dozens of kilometers from the nearest big city, true America. Complicated family circumstances were familiar to Frédéric Bourdain from his own biography. This somewhat bonded him with the missing Nicholas. Over time, he increasingly immersed himself in the role. Bourdain used the main technique of a pretender. He gathered information about his new identity and tried to apply it. For example, he heard some story from Nicholas Barclay's life from one of his relatives. Later, Bourdain would recount the same story to another relative as if he remembered it himself. He tried to adopt the teenager's manners, which he gleaned from conversations, and thus became more a part of the new family. His appearance and accent did not raise any objections or questions from the relatives, or perhaps they preferred to stay silent about it. Local media, of course, could not miss such a newsworthy event. After several years, the missing teenager from America miraculously returned home from another continent. Producers of a semi-sensational show on the local television channel were thrilled. They even hired a private detective for the program to uncover the details of the abduction. A detective by the name of Parker came to record an interview with the returned Nicholas Barclay. Unlike the teenager's relatives, the detective was troubled by the teenager's either French or Moroccan accent. In addition, he carefully compared an old photo of Barclay with the found teenager. Parker had heard somewhere that the shape of ears is almost as unique as fingerprints. Well, Nicholas's ears did not match the latest version at all. Furthermore, experts confirmed the detective's other suspicions. According to them, it is impossible to acquire an accent in one's native language over a few years, and no chemicals can change eye color from blue to brown. Parker tried to prove to Nicholas's mother and local authorities that the teenager was not real, but no one responded to his doubts. The Immigration Service referred to the relatives, and the relatives confirmed the identity. All's good. Meanwhile, Frédéric Bourdin continued living yet another life. Gradually, he began to ponder what had happened to the real Nicholas Barclay. Why were the relatives so eager to believe the implausible story concocted by the impostor? Why did they refuse to notice the obvious? On the 13th of June in 1994, Nicholas Barclay called home from the basketball court, asking for someone to pick him up. His older brother Jason, who answered the phone, told Nicholas to walk home. Since then, the teenager had been seen by no one. At least, this was the version of events recounted to the police by the missing boy's mother, Beverly, and brother Jason. Private Detective Parker discovered that in the weeks following the teenager's disappearance, several calls were made from Beverly's home. All of these were related to arguments between Beverly herself and her eldest son, Jason. It is important to note that both had periodic issues with illicit substances. Soon after, Jason had a run-in with the police due to an incident involving force against an officer. In general, his behavior became nervous and aggressive following his brother's disappearance. Relatives attributed this to moral guilt over what happened to Nicholas. Later, Jason was admitted to a rehabilitation center where he was during the alleged miraculous return of his brother from Europe. Frédéric Bourdin later claimed that when Jason first came to visit the found brother, he acted strangely. According to Bourdin, Jason knew exactly what had happened to the real Nicholas. The experienced fraudster began to suspect that in this situation it was not he who was deceiving them, but rather he who was being deceived. Meanwhile, the FBI was also involved in Nicholas Barclay's case. It was found that the American citizen had been abducted on American soil by an international cartel, which warranted investigators' attention. They quickly doubted the story told by Bourdin. Detectives attempted to persuade Nicholas's relatives to undergo DNA testing, but they flatly refused. One might wonder why. According to Bourdin, Beverly once lost her temper while drunk. She shouted that by sending him here, God was punishing her, that she did not know who he was, and questioned what on earth he was doing there. Beverly herself later denied that such a conversation ever took place. After half a year in the United States, Bourdin's story began to fall apart. By that time, the fraudster was feeling exhausted. The role was too long for one person, especially when playing a real individual rather than a fictional character. Meanwhile, the FBI had received DNA samples and fingerprints of the impostor from Interpol. Detective Parker lured Bourdin to a cafe for a talk. On the eve of this meeting, Beverly finally confessed to the investigator that her returned son was indeed an impostor. As a result, the fraudster cracked. He revealed his true name and confessed that he was wanted by Interpol. When the authorities came to arrest him, the impostor surrendered calmly. He became Frédéric Bourdin again, at least for a time. Bourdin informed the FBI of his suspicions regarding Beverly and her eldest son, Jason. According to the fraudster, they were somehow involved in the disappearance of the real Nicholas Barclay. It is clear that trusting the words of a serial fraudster is strange, yet investigators understood that the behavior of the relatives of the missing teenager was indeed odd. Beverly refused to undergo tests and for a long time covered for the obvious impostor Bourdin. The question is, why? Gradually, investigators collected more and more data indicating that there had been instances of violence in Nicholas Barclay's family. At the school where the teenager studied, as well as neighbours, confirmed these suspicions. Witnesses said they sometimes saw Nicholas with bruises and heard loud arguments. Beverly was summoned for a lie detector test. The main question investigators asked was, does the woman know where her son is? She answered no. The polygraph showed she was not lying. However, such technology is imperfect. It can give a false result for many reasons. One of them is if the person is on substances. Beverly was called for a repeat test after some time after ensuring she was clean. She was asked the same question. Does she know her son's whereabouts? Beverly again answered no. At that moment, the polygraph's needle began to swing wildly from side to side. According to the device, the woman was lying. And although the lie detector is an imperfect tool, investigators had yet another confirmation of their suspicions. They also decided to question the elder brother of the missing teenager, Jason. He denied any involvement in Nicholas's disappearance. An FBI investigator, however, admitted that, in his opinion, Jason was lying. A few weeks later, detectives learned that Jason had died from an overdose. Considering that the young man had been clean for a long time, investigators suspected that he had committed suicide. Perhaps Jason could not withstand the scrutiny and interrogations by investigators. Perhaps he was indeed involved in his brother's disappearance, as was his mother. A detailed theory could logically explain why the Barclay family had behaved so strangely for half a year. That Frederic Bourdin bore little resemblance to the missing teenager was obvious from the start. The Barclay mother and sister later explained the incident with emotions. Allegedly, yes, they saw that the teenager did not resemble Nicholas, but considering what had happened to him, they very much wanted to believe it was true. Ultimately, investigators found no serious evidence implicating the relatives in Nicholas Barclay's disappearance, nor did they find Nicholas himself. It is time to recall that this story is called The Chameleon. Its main character is Frederic Bourdin. Let us return to his personality, or rather, personalities. In 1998, an American court sentenced Frederic Bourdin to 6 years in prison. He was charged with perjury and possession of forged documents. But the very harsh punishment was likely dictated by the moral aspect of the case, as the impostor deceived a family that had lost a child. In his defense, Bourdin claimed he was merely seeking attention and love. Predictably, this statement incited anger in the courtroom. However, partially Frederic Bourdin was telling the truth. Several decades ago, several hundred identities ago, Frederic Bourdin was born in a Paris suburb. Back then, in 1974, his mother was only 18. According to her, the biological father of the child was an Algerian immigrant and her colleague at the margarine factory. However, the man was married, and Bourdin's mother did not even inform the father about the pregnancy. When Frederic was 2 years old, a court ruling granted custody to his maternal grandparents, as his mother could not manage her responsibilities. Bourdin moved with his grandparents to the south of France, to the city of Nantes. Some of Bourdin's teachers noted his vivid imagination, artistry, as well as signs of a mental disorder. Frederic fabricated tales about his life, pretended to have lost his memory or deliberately got lost in the streets of the city. At 12, Bourdin was sent to a boarding school. 4 years later, he fled to Paris. Wandering the empty streets, frightened and hungry, Frederic Bourdin invented his first fake identity. He approached a police officer and introduced himself as a lost British teenager named Jimmy Saylor. The deception quickly unraveled as Bourdin spoke poor English, and he was returned to the boarding school. There, the future master impostor began honing his con artist skills. A lost, frightened teenager. This image invariably evoked sympathy and helped Bourdin deceive the administrations of shelters, hospitals, and foster families throughout Europe. Yes, in weeks or months the deception would surface, and then Bourdin would create a new identity, change locations, and execute his schemes time and again. In essence, the authorities had nothing substantial to charge him with. Bourdin did not derive any tangible benefits from his deceptions, and he wasn't even 18. By his coming of age in the early 90s, Frederic had assumed dozens of identities and did not plan to stop. He travelled from one end of Europe to the other, impersonating a lost German, Spaniard, Briton, and eventually even a mute teenager. By the mid-90s, Bourdin had somewhat become a celebrity. His fraudulent activities were known not only to Interpol and the French police, but also to television networks. On one of the TV shows, he stated that the reason for his constant change of identity was the search for love and family. In response, his biological mother said that Frederic was merely trying to justify his actions. The older Bourdin became, the harder his craft turned. At 16, pretending to be another teenager was not difficult. At 20-something, it was already challenging. At 30, it became a whole art. Gradually, he honed every detail of his deceit, from behavior mannerisms to the intricacies of biography. Then came the year 1997 and Bourdin's long journey to the United States. After spending 6 years in an American prison in the early 2000s, the swindler returned to France and immediately invented a new identity for himself. At times, he stole or forged documents of real teenagers. Following another arrest, Bourdin was sent to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist concluded that in this case medicine was powerless and doctors were unlikely to cure Frederick of his harmful addiction to changing identities. However, in the late 2000s, after several short stints in a French prison for document forgery, Frederick Bourdin married and became the father of 2 children. He did all this under his real name. Bourdin was frequently invited onto French television where he spoke of his escapades and claimed to have changed 500 identities. How truthful this figure is remains uncertain, but even if it is divided several times over, the result is still staggering. The case of Frederick Bourdin vividly demonstrates that a compelling story is one of a swindler's main tools. In the case of the French chameleon, it is the lost teenager in distress. He is frightened, hungry, and needs help. As with any good story, it primarily operates on emotions, empathy, and compassion. At this moment, the victim's healthy skepticism and rational thinking yield to feelings. And what could better confirm this thesis than a brief story? Once, while walking down the street, the French poet Jacques Prévert saw a blind man. He was sitting on the sidewalk holding a sign that read, "Help a blind man." Prévert stopped and asked the man how he was doing, whether people were giving him money. "Not much," replied the poor man. "Some give, but little. Mostly everyone walks by." Then the poet asked for the man's sign and wrote another phrase on the back. The next day, Prévert returned and again asked the blind man how he was doing. "Wonderful," he replied. "Never in my life have I received so much money." On his sign was the inscription left by the poet, "Spring is coming, but I will not see it." Storytelling is the oldest form of entertainment, from fireside tales to cave drawings that are nearly 20,000 years old. Every successful swindler masters the art of storytelling. One cannot pass oneself off as a crown prince, a Hollywood star, a secret agent, or a 14-year-old teenager without a good story. Because the story is the key to trust, and trust is that thread the conman pulls to extract what they desire from the victim. Of course, it's important to remember that the story must be convincingly told. This confirmation is found not only among humans, but in the animal kingdom as well. For example, scientists have discovered that one species of caterpillar can boldly invade a dwelling occupied by ants. By doing so, the caterpillar receives more food, protection, and care from the ants than the ants themselves, into whose home it has intruded. But the most interesting question is, how does it achieve this? A caterpillar disguises itself as an ant queen, that is, a female who lays eggs. These ants produce certain sounds which the caterpillar mimics. Even if the specific group of ants that the caterpillar infiltrated is struggling with food, they still generously supply the impostor queen with nourishment because their species' reproduction depends on it. Scientists have discovered approximately a dozen species of such caterpillars. They all infiltrate ant nests and pretend to be females to, simply put, receive food and protection for free. This is a fitting moment to conclude the segment In the World of Animals and move on to another story of a famous impostor. Just as in the example with the infiltrating caterpillar, the main targets for fraudsters in the human world are money and other valuables. This is the tale of an impostor who managed to amass millions of dollars, deceiving even wealthy and influential Hollywood stars. In the summer of 2000, an artist by the name of Saran Pagan hosted a bohemian party at his house in the suburbs of New York. Art collectors, glossy magazine editors, offspring of shipping magnates, and leaders of global corporations were in attendance. But the most important guest was Christopher Rockefeller, who was raised in France, an heir to one of the richest and most influential families in history. The handsome, slender 30-year-old Rockefeller arrived with his companion. Throughout the evening, he spoke of his new yacht, promised to put in a good word with the governor of New York for one of the guests, and discussed purchasing several paintings with the host. This could have been one of the typical bohemian parties of the New York elite, if not for one crucial detail. It was all a setup. Artist Saran Pagan had met the so-called Rockefeller several times before and had discovered the man was an impostor. He organized the party, only to enjoy the impostor's hopeless attempts to convince everyone of his high lineage. Like Rockefeller couldn't tell a good Bordeaux for cheap California drink, spoke very bad English, and came to the meeting not in a Ferrari or Jaguar, but in a Mazda. However, the party organizer likely would not have staged such a spectacle if he truly knew the fraudster and his track record. It included the bribery of government officials, diamond smuggling from Africa, hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of dollars given to the impostor by his victims, as well as shooting illegal weapons and a corpse. And to begin with, we travel back 3 years to 1997. In one of the luxurious rooms of an expensive Los Angeles hotel, an intriguing gentleman resided for 6 months, sociable, slightly arrogant and audacious, a Frenchman. He intrigued men and attracted women. The gentleman introduced himself as Christopher de Laurentiis, a relative of a major film producer, Christopher de la Renta, the nephew of a famous fashion designer, and Christopher Reyes by the surname of his second wife, a Playboy magazine model. To some, Christopher even revealed his real surname, Rocancourt. He cruised around the city in a Ferrari and a Jaguar, claiming to own several luxury boutiques. His hotel room welcomed movie stars, businessmen, adventurers and dreamers, the typical inhabitants of the City of Angels. Apart from his claimed family connections with famous figures in the business and entertainment world, Christopher professed to be an influential investor. This was his story. Victims of the con artist were individuals who sought to make money or solve specific problems. Assuming the persona of a wealthy investor, Christopher integrated himself into various business deals to extract as much as possible from his partners. The scale of the swindle was astonishing in its variety. It could be a scheme involving hundreds of thousands of dollars as investments for opening an expensive nightclub, or it could be a simple hoax on an acquaintance for $10,000 under the pretense of a lucrative stock investment. Remarkably, the impostor managed to coax people out of money, even though his strong French accent sometimes made it difficult for interlocutors to understand Christopher Rocancourt. He nearly succeeded in sealing a bogus deal with Michael Jackson's brother Jermaine. Rocancourt proposed creating a line of perfumes named after the king of pop music's famous hits. For unknown reasons, Jermaine Jackson withdrew from the deal at the last moment. In another instance, Rocancourt swindled $250,000 from the legendary French pop star Michel Polnareff. Christopher promised the singer he could obtain a firearms permit. The con artist spent time with famous Hollywood actor and inveterate partygoer Mickey Rourke, and negotiated financing with Jean-Claude Van Damme for his film. Interestingly, both actors later denied knowing Rocancourt. In the con artist's address book were the phone numbers of Dolph Lundgren and Robert De Niro. However, Dodi Fayed held a particular interest for Rocancourt, as Fayed spent a significant amount of time in Los Angeles producing projects shortly before his death in a car accident with Princess Diana. It is unknown whether there were any real contacts between Fayed and Rocancourt. According to Dodi's assistant, the con artist behaved more like a stalker, arriving at his home under the guise of a potential buyer, and after Fayed's death, he purchased one of his cars. In 1998, while driving Fayed's former car, Rocancourt claimed to have been shot at by some Arabs he encountered the previous night at a club. The con artist reported the incident to the police. Several bullet holes were found on his car. Upon examination, the police concluded that all had been fired from inside the vehicle, and an unregistered gun was discovered with Rocancourt, who was then detained for questioning. A background check revealed an active warrant for his arrest for forging an American passport. The fact was that Rocancourt sought to con not only wealthy individuals looking to get richer, but also those who clearly had no extra money. A year earlier, the impostor had betrayed his own bodyguard. He promised to arrange a residence permit in the United States for him, which of course did not happen, Later, Réconcourt even tried to accuse the bodyguards of stealing valuable items from his hotel room. To some extent, the bodyguard might have considered himself lucky. One of Réconcourt's assistants in Los Angeles was found dead. It seemed to be a heart attack, but who knows? The deceived bodyguard, nevertheless, decided to take action and went to the police to report that his employer had unlawfully obtained an American passport by bribing several immigration service officials. An arrest warrant was issued, and Réconcourt was arrested a year after the shooting incident. From prison, the fraudster tried to reach out to his numerous celebrity contacts to ask for money for bail. However, neither De Niro nor Mick Jagger nor Van Damme responded to his request. Ultimately, Réconcourt's wife managed to gather about $200,000, and the Frenchman was released on bail. After that, the impostor disappeared. Many knew Christopher Réconcourt by one name or another, but none of his contacts in America, Europe, or Asia could actually answer the question, who is he really? Christophe Thierry Daniel Réconcourt was born in 1967 in a small town in Normandy, France, the son of a drunken failed artist and an underage prostitute. With the Rockefellers, Réconcourt shared only the first two letters of his surname. In all other respects, these people were on completely opposite sides of the social spectrum. First, the father left the family, then the mother placed 5-year-old Christophe and his younger sister in an orphanage in northern France. Throughout his education, Réconcourt concocted stories that his father was soon going to take him back, but this never happened. In the orphanage, Christophe was described as capable but restless and disobedient. He would take toys away from younger children and faced the police at an early age for minor offences. Later, a French family adopted the 12-year-old Réconcourt. The head of the family was a retired military officer, a strict person and a fan of strict discipline. He believed such upbringing would benefit the problematic teenager. Réconcourt ran away from the family several times, was brought back, and finally, immediately after reaching adulthood in the mid-1980s, Christophe left for Paris. A young man without connections and money in the big city. It was then that he realized he did not want to be Christophe Réconcourt, the poor offspring of a failed artist and a prostitute. Instead, the young man presented himself as an heir of wealthy Russian aristocracy, Prince Golitsyn. During his first 5 years in the French capital, Réconcourt ended up in prison 5 times for petty theft and forgery of documents and money. Finally, at the beginning of 1991, Christophe and his accomplices took a jewelry store salesperson hostage in neighbouring Switzerland and made off with jewelry worth nearly $500,000. The police issued a warrant for Réconcourt's arrest, but he managed to escape. Thus, at the age of 24, he found himself in the United States. It was around that time Christophe became Christopher. He met his first wife after introducing himself with the surname De Laurentiis, claiming to be the nephew of the famous Italian-American film producer. The marriage lasted about a year. His pregnant wife left Christopher after the family was pursued by creditors and people from whom her husband had taken money as investments. It was his former wife who turned Réconcourt into the authorities. She contacted the FBI, which found an active arrest warrant from the Swiss police, as well as a string of people deceived by the fraudster in the United States and Europe. Already arrested, Réconcourt called his wife and said that he knew she had turned him in. He also added, "Don't worry, I won't kill you." Christophe served his sentence in a French prison. Upon his release in the mid-1990s, he immediately returned to the United States to continue his fraudulent activities. What happened next in the following years you already know. In 1999, Réconcourt was arrested again, this time on the east coast of the United States. The charges were the same: unpaid hotel bills and fraud. The man showed the police documents in the name of Fabien Artune. He was released on bail and disappeared. Only after this did the police discover that they had actually apprehended the notorious con artist. Ultimately, Réconcourt was rearrested a little later, served several years in an American prison, and returned to France in the mid-2000s, where he continued his fraudulent activities rather successfully. Several of his well-known victims, a few short stints in French prison, And from the second half of the 2010s, Raconcourt mostly appeared not in crime reports, but in various TV and YouTube interviews, where he recounted his escapades. He told one journalist that he doesn't pity his victims because they all suffered due to their own greed. The quote from Christopher Raconcourt, which I presented at the end, is crucial for understanding the personality of a true fraudster. One of the main characteristics of such individuals is indifference and apathy towards their victims and their feelings. There is a special term for this phenomenon, psychopathy. A classic psychopath does not experience sympathy or empathy towards other human beings. For them, the suffering of victims means nothing. It does not evoke a sense of guilt. Statistically, about 1% of the male population are psychopaths. Among women, this number is significantly lower. However, psychopathy is not the only trait of good fraudsters. Experts highlight two other very important factors: narcissism and Machiavellianism. A classic narcissist is distinguished by a sense of entitlement and an exaggerated sense of self-importance. Machiavellianism implies cynical, aggressive, and manipulative methods to achieve personal goals. These very three aspects characterize a true fraudster. The proportions in each case may vary, but the main question is not about that. It is whether these qualities are innate or acquired during a person's lifetime. If you think about it, these qualities can also be found to some extent in successful politicians, lawyers, businessmen, marketers, and others. However, they did not become classic fraudsters, which means that not only innate qualities are important, but also life circumstances. A popular scientific saying goes that genes load the gun, but circumstances pull the trigger. This is confirmed by the life stories of the first two heroes of this narrative, and of the one I am about to discuss right now. A person claiming the title of the greatest impostor in history during 1951, the Korean War. A Canadian military ship discovered 19 Korean soldiers at sea. All of them were severely wounded. The chief doctor of the Canadian ship, military surgeon Dr. Joseph Sear, performed more than a dozen complex operations over a couple of days. In the end, all the soldiers survived. However, the happy rescue story had one important detail. Dr. Sear had no medical education at all. He had no education whatsoever. He didn't even finish school. How could a person without knowledge conduct complex surgical operations on the open sea, you may wonder? Well, for this impostor, medical textbooks were needed, a large supply of antibiotics for the patients, a small amount of alcohol for himself, and, of course, incredible confidence. The story of the miraculous rescue of 24 Korean soldiers spread throughout the Western press. The problem was that the real doctor, Joseph Sear, whom the fraudster was impersonating, indeed existed. He was a practicing medical professional in a small Canadian town, and of course did not expect the sudden notoriety. Dr. Sear's home phone was overwhelmed with inquiries from various media. Journalists tried to learn the details of his feat in Korea. Dr. Sear logically assumed that the journalist simply made a mistake. However, upon seeing the hero's photograph in the newspaper, Dr. Sear suspected something was amiss. The person in the picture was familiar to Sear. It was clergyman John Payne, and he himself had told the doctor that Payne was a pseudonym he adopted after deciding to leave his medical practice to dedicate himself to serving God. Before that, he was a doctor named Cecil Heyman. Dr. Sear's first thought was that Reverend Payne decided to return to medicine. But then the question arose, why did he adopt Dr. Sear's name? Soon after, the fraudster was exposed. To avoid creating a scandal, as an impostor had infiltrated a responsible position in the army, it was decided to release the fraudster without charges. Neither John Payne, nor Cecil Heyman, nor Dr. Sear were the real names of the doctor on the Canadian military ship. Under these pseudonyms was Ferdinand de Mara, one of the most famous impostors adventurers in history. Over several decades, he successfully posed as an engineer, a priest, a psychologist, a university founder, an accountant, a teacher, and dozens of other personas.
You bet your life. Say the secret word and take home an extra $100.
This was a popular American TV show of the 1950s. Its subjects included famous show business figures. In 1959, an unusual guest was present in the studio, a large, tall man. The host introduced him as the greatest impostor in history. When asked by the host why the man was not in prison, he responded,
"Well, I've never done anything completely wrong, Groucho. In fact, I've usually ended up..."
In this very broadcast, Damara recounted how he pulled off a fraud on a Canadian naval ship. The swindler took advantage of the documents of the real Dr. Joseph Sear to be accepted into service. He was then dispatched to Korea in the role of military ship surgeon. On the TV show, Damara spoke not only about how he managed to perform complex surgical operations without a shred of knowledge, but also about giving lectures to other medics on the ship. The host could not believe that for this and other exploits, Ferdinand had never been imprisoned. Damara replied that he indeed had prison experience, but not as an inmate. For a year he worked as a prison guard in Texas. This was one of his personas. This TV program is notable for several reasons. Firstly, it is a rare case where Ferdinand Damara appeared before the public under his real name, because for most of his adult life he was someone else. Secondly, the impostor owed his fame to the person who became a victim of the fraud by Damara. This was his biographer, Robert Crichton. Crichton was a journalist, not the most successful and wealthy, rather the opposite, and therefore constantly searching for the story that would make him successful and rich. He stumbled upon news about the escapades of Ferdinand Damara under various pseudonyms. Crichton thought that this was the ideal subject worthy of a book. He attempted to arrange an interview. Damara seemingly agreed, but did not show up first to one meeting, then another, and then a third. Crichton began to suspect that Ferdinand simply backed out. However, in reality, Damara came every time to the agreed place and observed the writer from the sidelines. He wanted to ensure he found a truly loyal person, or rather a victim he could manipulate. Crichton and Damara went on a journey to the theatres of the great impostor's feats. They travelled to many states in America, where Ferdinand posed as various personas. As a result of the trip, in 1959, Crichton's book on Damara, titled The Great Impostor, was published. The biography became a bestseller. A couple of years later, a Hollywood film was made based on it, where Damara was played by one of the most famous actors of that era, Tony Curtis. Thus, the country learned the story of the Great Impostor. Ferdinand Damara was born in a small American town in the north of the country. His father owned a small chain of cinemas. The business provided a good income, and the family was quite well off. Ferdinand began wearing formal suits at an early age. With his tall stature, large build, and specific choice of clothing, Damara stood out among his peers. However, soon a dark period began in Ferdinand's life. During the Great Depression, his father's business went bankrupt, and the family traded their large, beautiful home for what Damara himself called a shack on the outskirts of town. Soon after, Ferdinand's sister fell on the ice during a walk, struck her head heavily, and died. At that time, Damara was 16, and he decided to leave school and enter a monastery. Not just any monastery, he joined the Trappist order. It is a very strict Catholic community where brothers take a vow of chastity, renounce material things, and spend most of their days in physical labour and silence. Damara turned out to be a terrible monk. He overslept prayers, worked poorly, and sang instead of remaining silent. Eventually, Ferdinand left the Trappist community. Soon he attempted to become a monk once more in another location, but lasted even less time and again fled, a decision he admitted to regretting many times throughout his life. After this, there was a major turning point in Damara's biography. He decided to try something new, a new place, a new occupation, a new identity. In 1941, at the age of 20, Ferdinand joined the army. During his service in the Navy, he underwent minimal medical training and wished to enroll in medical school. However, due to lacking even a complete high school education, he could not do so. Thus, he assumed the identity of a real naval officer, Robert French, forged documents, and secured a teaching position at a university under a new name. A few years later, the deception was uncovered. Without much hesitation, Damara assumed a new identity as Dr. Cecil Hammond and obtained a teaching position at a Christian college. Then there was another brief period of monastic life under a new name, during which time Damara met Canadian Dr. Sear. The latter attempted to move to the United States, and the swindler offered to help him. This way, he acquired Sears' documents and under his name joined the Canadian Navy. It was there that the famous incident on a ship occurred with the rescue of Korean soldiers. After the surgeon, Demara, was exposed, he returned to the United States and continued switching roles and identities. He taught again, guarded prisoners in a jail, founded a college, and finally achieved fame in the late 1950s following the publication of the book The Great Impostor. This story admittedly evokes sympathy. A teenager, having endured several life upheavals, decided to become someone else. Yes, he did so literally and several dozen times, but who among us hasn't wanted to change their life at some point, right? Perhaps that is why the biography of The Great Impostor became a bestseller in the late 1950s. However, this story also had another side. Remember, I mentioned that one of Demara's main victims was his biographer. Well, the published book turned out to be not quite truthful. It concealed or greatly embellished moments that could have drastically changed the public's perception of Ferdinand Demara. The first version of the impostor's biography was much less flattering and significantly closer to the truth. However, Demara was a skilled manipulator, and despite the fact that writer Crichton was aware of many unflattering facts about the conman's life, he never made them public. Furthermore, he continued to associate with Ferdinand and helped him secure contracts for interviews and television shows. Do you remember the story about the accident with Demara's sister? This is one of the turning points in his biography. After this, he ran away from school and joined the monks. However, there is no evidence that Ferdinand Demara had a sister at all. After Demara left the monasteries, the monks discovered that money and automobiles were missing. Perhaps it was a coincidence, perhaps not. Ferdinand not only guarded the prison, but also served time there several times. These were short terms for fraud, but still, the heroic story of saving 24 Korean soldiers on a ship isn't all that smooth either. Yes, none of the patients died immediately after the surgery, but they were quickly taken ashore and transferred to a hospital. The soldiers' subsequent fate is unknown. It is quite possible that some of them died from complications following care from Demara, who was barely qualified as a surgeon. The minimal medical training he received during his service in the early 1940s was clearly insufficient for complex operations. Several times in his life, Demara worked with children, both as a teacher and as an organizer of a Christian camp. Complaints came from students repeatedly. Some spoke of harsh treatment, others claimed Demara made advances. Ferdinand denied all accusations. However, after another scandal arose, he preferred to move and change jobs. Demara failed to use his star moment in the late 1950s to somehow change his life. Despite numerous television interviews and shows for which he was well paid, he quickly found himself without money and returned to fraudulent activities, which he continued almost until his death from complications of diabetes in the early 1980s. Here it should be admitted that the conman probably never truly wanted to change and abandon fraudulent activities. Manipulation, deceit, acting, charisma, and of course, indifference to his victims were evidently Ferdinand Demara's main talents. Well, these were fascinating stories. Surely some of you caught yourself thinking, I would never fall for such a conman. It all seems obvious. But the fact is, any one of us can become a victim of such people. There is a stereotype that typical victims of fraudsters are trusting grandmothers and grandfathers. But that's not the case. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of prominent stories where educated, intelligent, and successful people have fallen victim to fraudsters. I'm sure each of you has been deceived at some point. Remember that person who initially seemed charming and positive, but after some time turned out to be a hypocritical, cynical scoundrel. Well, the same scheme works with fraudsters, just on a different scale. Therefore, if you haven't fallen victim to a major scam, it's largely a matter of luck. We tend to fall for fraudsters for several reasons, but perhaps the main one is this: we are evolutionarily wired for trust. A significant portion of our early life is spent looking up to adults and believing everything they tell us. This is important. It's a matter of our survival until we've understood the world ourselves. Moreover, we are social animals. and it's simply impossible to live in the modern world without trusting anyone. Okay, maybe it is possible, but that would condemn you to a miserable existence. We don't walk down the streets thinking every passerby is a potential thief, nor do we go to bed seriously preparing for a murderer to break in at night. This doesn't mean such things don't happen in the world, but they are clearly not the daily looming threats they once were centuries ago. Today, the feeling that most people around us are more or less decent is the status quo. Fraudsters precisely exploit this. We simply do not expect to be deceived. Furthermore, in essence, every fraudster sells the victim a better version of their life, one where the person is richer, healthier, more successful, and happier. And here, it doesn't matter whether you are a Hollywood star or a 70-year-old pensioner. We all want to make our lives somewhat better.